In a world so connected, why is it that so many people are feeling more alone than they've ever felt in their lives? The US Surgeon General has called out loneliness and isolation as an epidemic that is affecting millions of lives. Men, they often latch on to their partners, which then becomes that dependent relationship that avoids loneliness only until a point, because if they were to lose their partner, either by death or separation or divorce, they would fall into a huge pile of loneliness because they have almost not focused on a lot of their relationships and friendships because they're focused on other parts of their life, including their business and even family life. The reality is that loneliness actually affects both the mental and physical component of a human being. There's a higher risk if you are going through isolation or loneliness that you will have depression, high blood pressure, and the development of stroke, obesity, and also cognitive decline, whether it be Alzheimer's disease or other cognitive issues that you can have. Social media and the rise of it has been a big factor. It has taken up a lot of our time because we doom scroll and just spend a lot of time on it because it's more entertaining than actually picking up the phone and having a deep conversation with another human being or even getting in the car to meet someone else. If you're still struggling to find a friend and you know you're going through isolation and even loneliness, then I would almost implore you to be that friend for someone else. In a world so connected, why is it that so many people are feeling more alone than they've ever felt in their lives? Welcome back to Peak Performance Hacks, and I'm your host, Doctor Gan. And today I'm going to be diving into a deep and often overlooked topic, which is loneliness and not having a community of people to support you in your mission and even during your challenging times, especially for those peak performers and high achievers that are trying to crush it in life and in their business. Now, the US Surgeon General has called out loneliness and isolation as an epidemic that is affecting millions of lives. He's likened it to thirst and hunger, and it is almost a factor of a must in your life for survival rather than a need. Now, the biggest challenge we have is quantifying loneliness, because if you created a questionnaire and put it out to people, especially men, most of them would never tick the box of feeling lonely. Now, women, on the other hand, are a lot much better at creating relationships and also maintaining relationships. And when they have challenges when it comes to loneliness, they're often the first ones to reach out for help and even identify it as a problem versus men. But what we have found, though, is that for men, they often latch on to their partners, which then becomes that dependent relationship that avoids loneliness only until a point, because if they were to lose their partner, either by death or separation or divorce, they will fall into a huge pile of loneliness because they have almost not focused on a lot of their relationships and friendships because they're focused on other parts of their life, including their business and even family life. One of the studies that was done in Australia looking at men with loneliness found that there were multiple factors leading to loneliness. Some of them included cultural factors. Others included where they were located and also beliefs around gender roles, whether they were breadwinners or not, with men that thought that they were breadwinners and of the household feeling that they had an obligation to focus on their work and also focus on their family rather than on their friendships, which they often sacrificed. There are studies that have shown that over the years suggest that loneliness is actually highest in the 40s and then again during the retirement stage. And I feel when you look at it, the part of the reason that this actually occurs is that if you look at the cycle for most people in terms of their stages of their lives, they start off at school having some friends or even a friend. They then move on to further studying, maybe uni, again, having lots of friends there or even a friend. And then the next stage of your life whereby you're working and you have colleagues or work friends whereby you have to almost meet up because it's a part of the culture of working. And then finally into the next stage whereby you're meeting your partner and maybe starting a family. And that generally can vary with the age being anywhere between the late 20s all the way to late 30s. And your children then growing up. So it kind of fits that profile whereby this tends to happen around the 40s. And then again in retirement, because of the focus being on work and family for all those years, when you essentially stop doing what you normally did, you feel quite alone because you need to fill that void which may have been your work in the past. Then all through that time, the close friends that you may have had, you've essentially not focused on those relationships and they've essentially disappeared. And this is where the loneliness starts because there aren't those friendships. So what do we know in terms of what loneliness can do to our bodies and even to our mind? There's a higher risk if you are going through isolation or loneliness that you will have depression. There's also a higher risk of high blood pressure and the development of stroke. There's a higher risk of obesity and also cognitive decline, whether it be Alzheimer's disease or other cognitive issues that you can have. When you actually look at it and you look at prisons, one of the things that they do when they try to punish a prisoner is they put them in solitary confinement. Now, I do understand with solitary confinement, you're depriving people of their senses, but you're also depriving them of any human connections. And so this is a very important point that often gets missed. The reality is that loneliness actually affects both the mental and physical component of a human being. And they're both interrelated. So affecting the mental aspect can affect your body, physically having disease or medical conditions that I mentioned earlier, but also having conditions medically can affect how you feel mentally as well. And so the interconnectedness is very important and often gets missed because most people think that loneliness is only affecting how you feel in your mind, but it actually can affect you physically in terms of the higher risk of developing certain conditions, as I mentioned earlier. So how have we got to this point? Now, social media and the rise of it has been a big factor, and I'm not going to poo-poo it because it is something that is not going to go away and it is part of our lives, but it has taken up a lot of our time because we doom scroll and just spend a lot of time on it because it's more entertaining than actually picking up the phone and having a deep conversation with another human being or even getting in the car to meet someone else. So for a lot of us, it's easier to actually just look through the phone, which is easily accessible. It's always with us. And then we end up going down this rabbit hole. And the next I would mention would be video games and even streaming content that we enjoy watching, whether we have a binge of watching our favorite series or start playing a video game that we really enjoy. And before you know it, 3 or 4 hours have gone. And it's a lot more entertaining. And it prevents us from feeling bored or assists in that feeling that when we feel bored and we don't want to actually exert a lot of energy in terms of concentrating and thinking when we're engaging with another human being. And that sort of brings me to the next point is that when video conferencing and the innovations that we had with video calls, that we could essentially talk to anyone anywhere in the world, whether it be a family member or a loved one, has actually revolutionized everything that we do these days. But again, not taking the time to actually go and meet someone or even having a discussion with a group of people whereby you can actually feel the energy flow within the group has sort of been deprived as a result of the innovations that we've had in our lives. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still better to meet up on a video call with friends if it's not possible to meet them, rather than not meeting them at all. So I do get that it has its place, but it has sort of starved us from that human connection that we were used to getting because we had to make the effort to do it. And that sort of leads me to the friendship issue. Now, with many people, they may divide their friend circles into true friends and acquaintances. Now, true friends, as you would know, would be people you confide to, you trust, you love, and you could tell them anything and they have your back. Now, acquaintances could be a variation of work colleagues. They could be people you met at networking meetups. It could be even social groups or even sports groups whereby you're there with them for the time, but the focus is on what you're actually doing. So if it was sports, you'd be focused on playing the sport, but there wouldn't be that depth of sharing between them. And again, that is a problem because if you don't actually have true friends where you can talk about this and you feel comfortable enough, then despite having a community of people, you're not actually intentionally there physically and mentally, other than the fact of what you're doing there. So if it was business related, that is the focus. If it was sports, that would be the focus. Now, again, if you're someone that feels isolated or lonely, being in a community like this is better than not actually having any community at all. But again, it's not the best form of a community that you need to have when it comes to why we have issues with loneliness and isolation and not being able to have that friendships. So what can you do if you find yourself in a position where you're lonely and you're quite isolated? If you had those true friends, and many people have at least one friend that they've had even from childhood, you need to potentially reach out to these people and try to build the trust and relationship again. Now, if you've sacrificed it in the past as a result of focusing on your career, on your work, your business, and even in your family life, then it may be time for you to resurrect it by reaching out and hoping that they would reach back out. And if they're really your true friends, then they would potentially, there shouldn't be any hindrance there. And most people would want to connect as long as you're making the effort and putting the energy. Now, if you have lost your true friends for whatever reason, you've moved or you're not around people that you could find true friends, then you may want to consider joining a community. Now, I mentioned sports groups and I mentioned networking groups, but these could be interest groups that you may have. Maybe you're into cycling groups, maybe you're into running, maybe you're into antique cars or even electric cars, maybe you're into reading clubs. Now, these are places where you'll have to sift through people again to eventually find someone that you may have a connection with and then become a good friend there. And the next I would say is that if you can't find an interest group or community that you can connect with, the next best thing to do is to essentially form your own group. Now, this takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of energy, but it will be well worth it if you can find a community that has a similar interest, and eventually you'll find a great friend there as well. And I would even go out and say that if you're still struggling to find a friend and you know you're going through isolation and even loneliness, then I would almost implore you to be that friend for someone else. And what I mean by this is that if you know someone that doesn't make the effort or doesn't take the energy, and you know that they do not hang out with other people as well, then I would try to be a friend for them and keep reaching out. And eventually this will pay you back in spades in terms of that friendship that you develop with this other person, because they will trust you and they will know that you actually took the time or took the energy to spend time with them and also focus on that friendship that you had. Now, with community groups and also reaching out to friends that you've known before and also sporting groups, they're all great to have. But if you find yourself being completely lonely and isolated and you feel that you just need more support, then I would even reach out to seeing a counselor or even talking to someone, which may not be your best friend or your great friend at that moment, but would be someone that could help you through this, especially if you're in a really deep and dark place where you feel that you don't have people to talk to. And I think for most people that if you took the time and energy to actually put it out there, you will eventually find someone with that same energy and it will come back to you in so many ways that you can't imagine. So if you're someone who has taken the route whereby you've just focused on family or even work, and you've forgotten about your relationships, I think it's time to resurrect them and start focusing on them as much as you would do for anything else in your life. This wraps up this episode of Peak Performance Hacks. All the links and resources are in the video description or in the resource section, whether it is on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're watching this on YouTube, please consider subscribing. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a review so that more people can discover our podcast and it could benefit them as well. Until I catch you next time, speak soon.